And we're looking at what we now consider to be dispensations in the Bible. We've looked at a number of things that divide the Jew from the Gentile, from the church from the Old Testament Jew. I'd like to begin with me this afternoon by coming to the book of Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9. We began with the age of innocence a few weeks ago, roughly Genesis 1 through 3, those three chapters, when man was created and put into the garden, and he and his wife were given dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and they were to keep the garden and to dress it. And of all the trees of the garden he could freely eat, but of the tree which was in the midst of the garden, God said, "Thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die." And that was followed by the age of conscience, roughly chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And that was, of course, that followed after sin entered into the world and into the minds and the hearts now of men. After God destroys that world with a flood, after he spares one man, Noah, and his household, because he found him righteous, and God found grace in the eyes, in his eyes, in Noah, then the world enters what we now will begin as the dispensation of the age of human government, the age of government. And that's going to be roughly Genesis 9, 10, and 11, those three chapters. As far as we talk about dispensations, God dispensing something, some more revelation of himself, some more command to men, some more expectation of men, and the way that they conduct themselves before him. But notice there, Genesis chapter 9 and verse 1 says, "And God blessed Noah and his sons, and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered." That is, the animals, the fish, and the birds, and so forth. And one of God's new commands concerned the eating of animal flesh. Look at verse 3. "Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you. Even as the green herb have I given you all things." And God would allow men in this new age of time to eat the animals, but specified that he did not want them eating it raw with the blood. Notice there in verse 4. "But flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye not eat." So evidently the food would have to be prepared in some way. Had to be cooked in order to eat it, although he didn't go into great detail. It's rather a conclusion you'd have to arrive at in order that the blood could be drained away and cooked away from the meat. Man was now to govern himself, and he was to govern the animal world around him by exercising judgment and justice for the shedding of any man's blood, whether it was shed by another man or shed by an animal. Begin there, verse 5. "And surely your blood of your lives will I require, at the hand of every beast will I require it, and at the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man." God said any animal that takes a human life, the animal's life is then forfeit. And same thing held true with another man, someone guilty of murder or killing another person. Their life would be forfeit. And so whenever you hear these animal rights people, or PETA, complaining that they shot a mountain lion that was coming down out of the hills into the neighborhoods and endangering someone, don't feel sorry for the mountain lion. And if the mountain lion attacks someone and kills somebody, then it's to be put to death. And God says, at the hand of man at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man, and as well as the life of the animal. The animal's life is then to be taken forfeit for slaying a man. See, that's the difference between animals and men in God's economy, the Old Testament. People think animals and humans are the same in this day and age. All that proves is people are nuts. But in the time of the Bible, the Old Testament, God's estimation of the value of a man was much greater than that of an animal. And in fact, he told him in chapter 1 that he would have dominion over the animals, over the fish of the sea. And he repeats it again here in Genesis 9. And so the animal was not as high in value in God's estimation. They were subordinate, subservient, to be held dominion over by man. And when God commanded sacrifices, which we'll get to eventually in the law, he commanded that the animal would be brought, and he specified a bull or a turtle dove or a lamb or a ram to be brought and offered as a sacrifice for specific sins and transgressions. But the next time the man sinned, he had to bring another one, because the animal was not equal to the man in value. And this is the marvelous thing of the death of Christ. Not only was Jesus Christ a man, God in the flesh, but because he was God, he was of greater and eternal value over the man, so that his death doesn't have to be repeated each time. His death was sufficient. He was so complete and perfect in his own essence as God manifest in the flesh. His death one time would be sufficient to cover all the sins of all men of all time. And so that's why we believe someone's blaspheming God when they say we have to re-crucify Christ in our form of communion or whatever, Mass, whatever they want to call it. But the value of the Son of God was certainly of greater value than that of man. But the value of the animal was not as great as the man, so it had to be repeated. And man was responsible to destroy any animal that would take a man's life. A man was responsible for the governing of other men. No longer was government simply an individual responsibility, as it was in the age of conscience. God no longer set a mark on someone that was a murderer. You recall when Cain slew his brother Abel, the Bible says God set a mark upon Cain lest any finding him should slay him in the way, Genesis 4:15. But now he requires capital punishment. He says, at the hand of man, here in verse 5. So henceforth, God exhorted man to order his own government, and upon the foundation of justice and judgment. Look at a verse over in Proverbs 21. Proverbs 21. And verse 3. Proverbs 21:3. Now back up to verse 1. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, as the rivers of water. He turneth it whithersoever he will. Every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord pondereth the hearts. To do justice and judgment is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. So God wanted men to order his world, govern his society, govern the actions of men according to divine justice and divine judgment. And there is to be judgment of actions and justice imposed for any wrongdoings, and to establish and maintain order. That's the purpose of a governing body, of government over men, is to maintain some semblance of order and restraint against evil. Romans 13 tells us that much about the powers which be that are ordained of God. And there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God, that they are ministers of God to execute wrath upon the disobedient. And so anyone who says, I don't want government meddling anything, we don't need government, the less government the better, it's not the government's job to tell me what I can eat, what I can drink, what I can smoke, what I can do with my spare time. I don't want them in my bedroom, I don't want them in my wallet, I don't want them in my finances, and I understand the sentiment. But there's a certain measure of government that is authorized by God. There's a fellow that taught me the Bible when I was in Bible school who wrote a book called Christianity and War. And he's taken up the real pacifistic view that it should never be thought of in the Christian's mind to support war. And we should never support the armed forces, the military, when what they're doing is simply going out looking for some fight. And we invade countries and this and that, and all of the sort of the left-wing talk you hear. Well, he lost his position teaching the Bible at the Bible school I went to, and now he spends all of his time writing articles how we should legalize drugs and not enforce the war on drugs. He says the war on drugs has failed, that we should, the government should stay out of my bedroom, should stay out of my life. It's not the government's job to decide what I drink, smoke, ingest, inhale, snort, sniff. It goes down the list. I have no intention of doing anything illegal or buying drugs or using drugs. But I don't think it's the government's job to worry about other people who do. And that the government needs to stay out of everyone's business. Let me tell you something. In this world, if the government doesn't defend what a marriage ought to be, a man and a woman, who will? If the government doesn't defend the life of an unborn baby, who will? The government has a role to play. And the government's role is to be a check on wrongdoing and to punish evildoers. That's their role. That's the purpose for which God instituted them. And sometimes wrongdoing encroaches into the national interest of a people. Jesus talked about the good man of the house. If he knew what hour, what watch of the night the thief would come, he would wake and not suffer his house to be broken up. And that sentiment's been interpreted in American courts for generations to mean that if a guy breaks into your house and you have the ability to use deadly force to stop him, to kill him, you're justified in doing so. Remember the woman down in Oklahoma just a few weeks ago who shot the intruder to protect herself and her toddler? And she was justified in doing so, and I've heard her interview on the radio since then saying, I'd do the same thing again. It was either him or me. And the court found her guilty of nothing. Innocent, any charge that could be brought against her for defending herself. Well, you take that same premise and expand it to mean the safety of the interest. Listen, don't you think we have some interest in stopping radical fanatics that would want to bomb the United States, kill the United States? I realize I might sound like just bloodthirsty, but hunt them down and kill them first. The world you live in is a dangerous world. And if you were to take out all the references to military, all the references to armed warfare and combat, and fighting the Christian fighter, fighting as a good soldier, the illustrations of soldiers' weaponry and warfare that are applied to the Christian, you have to know something about the purposes of weapons and military and defense and self-defense and so forth in order to make the application to yourself as a Christian. If you were to take out all the references to war and warfare and military in the Bible, you'd reduce it down to a very small booklet. Because God uses that and said, this is not laughing matter. You're in serious warfare spiritually as a believer. And sometimes that manifests itself in the real world. So don't believe that you can just be an active, or rather a passive observer of the world around you and say it's not our job to defend any kind of military action. It's not in keeping a good Christian conscience to defend war, support war. You know what? All the founders of America, those who profess to know Jesus Christ as their Savior, they believe the Bible was the words of God. They saw no conflict in their right to defend the colonies against British occupation or British invasion. They thought it was their duty before God to defend what God had granted them. A place of liberty, a place of religious freedom, and a place to exercise one's own conscience before God. And they saw no conflict with professing faith in Christ as Christians and supporting war. So I wonder about that. God places in the hands of men human government, the governing of his own actions, the governing of the actions of others. God the Son will one day take this responsibility upon himself. Look forward at the book of Isaiah, chapter 9. Isaiah chapter 9. Isaiah 9 and verses 6 and 7. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. Notice, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment, and with justice from henceforth even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. Well, one day that will take place, but right now God has committed the governing of men's conduct, the punishment of wickedness and evildoers into the hands of men themselves. Mankind is responsible for that. Now, of course, as his nature is, man wastes very little time in going back to his sinful ways. And he did this not only through individual sins. I don't know if you still have your finger there in Genesis chapter 9. Come back to Genesis 9. Let's read verses 21 and 22. Genesis 9, verses 21 and 22. And he drank of the wine, and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without. So he's to govern individual sins, but as also societal sins. Men rebelled against God's command to replenish the earth. And instead of scattering the earth, he stayed together and devised a plan. Look at Genesis chapter 11, verse 4. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. Let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Go to, let us go down to there. I'm getting ahead of myself. So once again, man tried to reach God his own way. Remember how Cain brought the first fruits of that he had grown and offered that to God. But Abel brought a more excellent sacrifice. He brought a lamb, the firstlings of his flock. God had respect to Abel's sacrifice and his offering, but unto Cain and his offering he had not respect. Genesis 4 tells us. So men try to reach God through their own efforts. In this case, Genesis 11, by building a tower, they thought they could reach up high to heaven and then have access to God. You wonder what the purpose was of some of these ancient pyramids down in Peru, down in Mexico, Aztecs, maybe even the Egyptians. Well, it had something to do with reaching or making contact with God, or the gods as they were deceived later, or Genesis 6, by earthly means. Somehow reaching high up, we can get up there and have a better view of the world around us and somehow qualify to make contact, access with God. Of course, I don't want to go down the trail of speculating on whether UFO occupants built the pyramids or anything like that. I don't go that far. I don't buy that. But man tries to reach God without regard to God's commands or God's way. And he incurs the judgment of God once again. And this time, God brings a societal judgment. Results in the beginning of languages being divided, and the people being scattered over the face of the earth. Let's begin there in chapter 11, verse 6. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do. Now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. And from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. God not only scattered mankind by dividing him into languages, but he also reinforced that scattering by dividing the earth's dry land mass after the flood. And I'm not sure how long it took after the flood for all of the continents to be fully settled and established. But look at an interesting verse back in chapter 10, verse 25. And unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided. And his brother's name was Joktan. That's been speculated by some. I don't know if it's true or not. I don't know if it can be established that somehow the landmass, the continents, were clearly divided in the lifetime of this man, Peleg. During his lifetime is when the surface of the earth finally took its shape that we know it by today. South America, Africa, South Pole, the rest of the European continent, the little fingers of every peninsula that stick out, islands scattered throughout the sea, the Greek Isles, the British Isles, the isles in Asia, the Philippines, the Indonesia, and all of these places that we identify now as countries and nations and geographical places fixed by God. And but it's, I think, largely, at least for me, conjecture that that's what was taking place when it says God divided, or the earth was divided. I'm not sure what that phrase means in verse 25 of chapter 10, but it might mean that God fully established the land masses or the isles, the places where men could dwell, they could not dwell. Someone's commented that during the age of innocence, God pronounced judgment on man's spirit. The Bible says the eyes of them both were naked, and they were opened, rather than they knew that they were naked. Part of that, they had no knowledge of what it means to be spiritually unclean before God. They had never sinned before. During the age of conscience, God pronounced judgment on man's body by the flood and then by the ongoing command of the government to execute killers. During the age of government, God judges the soul of men. That is the part of man that discerns when something is right and when something is wrong. And he knows he's doing it, and he knows he's going to be accountable for it. And so he restrains men by dividing men according to language. Dr. Ruckman's got a real humorous narrative here in Genesis chapter 9, or rather chapter 11, his commentary about how these guys working a construction site building the Tower of Babel, and suddenly their languages are confounded. They can't understand what the other guy's saying. One guy's asking for a hammer, and the other guy thinks he's insulting him. That's what it sounds like to him. And how the bickering, the fighting goes on, and the whole thing just falls to pieces, and the tower has to come to a screeching halt because nobody can understand what the other guy is saying. You know, language is largely the outgrowth of the way of the mind thinks. In Western thought, we have a certain linear way of thinking, and we organize our sentences that way. It follows a certain pattern, a certain order. The noun is followed by a verb, the noun doing something, and it reaches the object of the sentence, the secondary subject of the sentence, as a very orderly system, at least to us. And our speech reflects the way we think. And speech undoubtedly reflects the way other cultures think, whether it be Chinese culture, which uses and Japanese too, use a system of pictographs to depict concepts and phrases that are conveyed with a certain drawing or picture, and then a series of these pictures put together to tell the story. And it seems difficult to our way of thinking, because we're used to having it all spelled out for us, literally, with an alphabet of letters. Which ones are the vowels, which are the ones are the consonants, how do they work together, how do they mesh with other words to convey a very, very clear thought. And thus we speak. But you notice in English we put the adjective before the noun. We say the White House. Spanish does it just the opposite, Casa Blanca, house white, if you were to be literal in translating it. And so language is the product of the thoughts going on in the mind. So undoubtedly the Lord had to mix up the way men think and set them back a little ways so that they they start seeking out other people who spoke the same language they were now speaking, because their thoughts were different. If they were all thinking at one time and speaking the same language, suddenly they weren't able to speak the same language, because undoubtedly they weren't thinking, processing information in their mind the same way either. Because language is an outgrowth of the process of the mind, the way you're thinking. And so they would seek out other people who were speaking the same language, and thus the nations began to establish themselves. And you have to, I guess, assume, although the Bible doesn't give you detail, assume that God also began to divide people, and would eventually divide people according to racial divisions, coupled with the language. Certain people spoke these languages, or these accented tongues, went off in one direction. Those that spoke another went off in a different direction. Those who speak others went in different directions. And that, coupled with climate, geography, a number of other external factors, probably contributed to the racial distinction, the racial characteristics. And the farther you went from that centralized place, the more pronounced those distinctions become. The Japanese, for example, landlocked, not landlocked, they're on an island for centuries and centuries. Very little admixture from the outside world of other cultures, other races. And in Dr. Ruckman's book on racial divisions, I think he speculates that the Japanese probably represent the purest form of the Shemitic people, because they've been isolated on an island for centuries and centuries, not intermixed with anyone else by land. Yeah, it may be, may not be. The farther south you go on the African continent, the more isolated those people are from any contact of outside culture and outside races. And likewise, the farther west you go, in European Isles or Scandinavia, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, they bear a very distinct appearance from other Caucasians of England, Germany, France. Norwegians, they all look alike. I never thought I would say this, but about white people, we like to joke and make fun of other people, so they all look alike, but Norwegians all look alike. At least to me they do. When the Winter Olympics were held in Norway, they were profiling some, family, how the daily life of Norwegians. As the father, the mother, the kids, all of them look the same. They all look the same. And I don't know if that's just the climate, the isolation from much contact with other European cultures, but to me they bore very striking similarities with each other, unlike people in, like I say, England or Germany. Now, Italians, they have a similar look. All the men have mustaches, just like their mothers do. Ireland, they all have red hair, right? You see two black people, a young man, a young woman, they say, oh, they're the boyfriend and girlfriend. See two Chinese people, boyfriend, girlfriend. See two redheads, brother and sister. What's wrong? Nobody assumes that a redhead's going to date another redhead. So all of these distinctions certainly came about, and we're not going to dwell on any of those possibilities or today. But God instituted after the flood what we call and understand now as the age of human government. Now man is accountable to God for how he governed the affairs of himself and of other men, how he punished those who would take a life, whether it be a man or an animal that took a human life. That person's life was now forfeit. And see how these build one on the other. The age of innocence is followed by the age of conscience. Now he knows what's right and wrong. After the age of conscience comes the age of government. Now, I have to do something with the knowledge I have. When that conscience is violated, that law is broken, now I'm responsible to punish the wrongdoer. And all of these things hold men responsible. And that's very much how the pattern of a young child growing up. I think, in some ways parallels these different ages or dispensations. You get to an age of government, now you are able to hold the child responsible for behaving or misbehaving. Prior to that, he didn't understand it. He knew when he was doing something wrong, age of conscience, but it wasn't to the point where you could then hold him responsible and say, you're going to get a whip if you disobey. And before that, the age of innocence, a little baby or a toddler, he doesn't understand right and wrong yet. And like I said, they run around without a stitch of clothing on, don't realize anything's wrong with it. Because as Adam and Eve said that they were both naked in the eyes of them, and they knew they were naked and before the Lord. So let's stop right there and give you some food for thought, things to think about. But only God can straighten man's wickedness out. And